Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish Prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.
And welcome back, folks, to Through a Scottish Prism. Lovely to have you back again. Well, it's been a few weeks. Not planned, as you know. I'd just like to say to all of those who wished me well when I had my little visit and stay in the hospital in Dubai. I greatly appreciated all your kind and best wishes. It really, honestly did make a big difference when I couldn't even lift my head off the pillow. It was nice to get those cheery messages, and I'm on the road to recovery, I'm glad to say. Got my appetite back. I'm back home in Catalonia and raring to go for the fight because there's plenty to do. The parliaments might be in recession, but we're not. And to kick off this, because it's been a couple of weeks since we've had a wee get together, I brought in three of my favourites to join me tonight. Of course, I couldn't without the Paisley Mohawk. He gets abandonment issues if I don't have him with me. That's just the way he is. Paisley Mohawk, Iain Lawson himself, and the Gareth, my dear friend, the grouse beater, to add a bit of class to us. And I'm also got, of course, one of the favourite guests of you all, and that's Professor Alf Baird, who, before his retirement, and I better get this right or I'll be in trouble, was the Maritime Business and Director of Maritime Research Group at the Edinburgh University, and was his PhD in Strategic Management and Global Shipping. Now, we will be talking about shipping. There's lots of things I want to talk to him. I've been trying to get the Prof on other things, mainly about shipping, and we're going to go into that, but we'll be starting with some other things first. So please welcome my guests as they join me here and Through a Scottish Prism. And here we are. We've got Gareth. Hello, my friend Gareth. How are you?
Good evening to you, sir.
And
I'm waiting for the main movie to start. I just got your commercials first.
Yeah, the Pearl Indeed. And Alf, nice to have you back again, Alf. Always a pleasure to see you. And my dear friend, Mr. Lawson, back from Greece, looking tanned and fit there, Mr. Lawson.
Well, certainly tanned.
Guys, it has been a couple of weeks, but it's nice to get, and I thought we would just have a wee round table today and chat, because there's quite a lot of things going on. And as I said there in my intro, I want to get on to talking to Alf later on about, the 41 Irish routes and the 0 Scottish ferry routes into Europe. It's, I think, a topic that we should be discussing and the general public. But I'd like to start with what I think is the story of the week, which was, of course, Dominic Cummings, and telling the world that when they signed the agreement, our friends at Westminster with the European Union, they had no intention of keeping the agreement, and they were going to break it as soon as the election was over, and they destroyed the Labour Party, which doesn't come as a surprise to any of us here. But there was a reaction from Ireland, which we'll talk about. And also, it's in the same week where we've been told that they're going to create 10 new constituency seats in England to improve their franchise by removing 8 seats from Wales, from tiny Wales, 8 seats, and 2 from Scotland, so that they've got a franchise that suits them, not the union, but suits the English. And it's something that we should discuss. Gareth, what did you think when you heard Cummings saying that they'd always intended breaking the agreement with the European Union?
I distinctly remember Boris Johnson, when he was being grilled about how he would solve the Brexit dilemma, actually stating that we could have a customs in the middle of the Irish Sea and afterwards renegotiate. He did actually, he was telling the truth at that point. For once, that you get Brexit done. He kept saying that. We've got to do, everything has to be done. And he did actually say that they would renegotiate any problems as they arose. So, yeah, it was all part of the plan.
Yeah. And Alf, did it shock you that the British were deciding that they would just break an agreement at the first opportunity?
No, really, Roddy. I go with the perfidious Albion kind of history. And we only need to look back at the vow back in 2014 to see basically what might have been had we been independent, a treaty. But even an agreement between nations, there was no such agreement that came out of the discussions, I think, in the National Museum afterwards. And all the amendments that the Scottish MPs tried to pass in Westminster were all rejected. So the vow was another fraud. I think that we've just had so many frauds, but the union itself now with Brexit is basically broken. And I don't see any other option now but the strategy put forward by the Scottish Sovereignty Research Group. So I'm expecting Scottish MPs and MSPs at some point they're going to have to do this because a referendum might never happen. So at some point they're going to have to step up to the plate, and that seems to be the problem they have at the moment. They're just unable or unwilling to exercise sovereignty.
Brexit confirmed that Westminster is just a tyranny, and it trashed the treaty, absolutely. But somebody has to tell the SNP.
Well, there are some of us here trying. I mean, Iain, perfidious Albion didn't come as any shock to you, and the way that they've behaved. Admitting it was I thought was quite unusual.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I had a blog this week where we quoted the English First Minister at the time of the Treaty of Union, where he was quite openly saying very shortly afterwards that, this is the way we behave. We don't pay any attention to any clauses, there's nothing unchangeable. But I think the real danger here is, and I think to some extent the discussion so far is falling into that trap as well, because what I think is happening is I think we're witnessing some great political theatre here between Nicola Sturgeon and Boris Johnson, and she's insisting she gets this gold standard Section 30, which all of us around the table here know is a trap, because the franchise is so bad, there's no way we'll probably win that referendum. And I think what's going to happen here is Nicola's going to keep saying, I want my Section 30 referendum. And one of these days, Boris is going to turn around and say, you're quite right, you should have it, on you go, and here's some conditions. And one of those conditions will be the franchise, which was the same in 2014 and which cost us victory, will be the same franchise this time round, but much worse, because there's far more people from south of the border in Scotland now than were here in 2014. It's a trap. That's what's going on. And both sides are playing the trap, both Scotland through Nicola Sturgeon and England through Boris Johnson. We're getting set up in front of our eyes.
Yeah, I think.
Well, if it's theatre, it's Beckett. It's waiting for Godot. The actors on the stage don't move very much.
No.
I think it might have been you, Iain, that gave me some information, but it kind of sums up this and confirms what you're saying about the franchise being increased by more from south of the border. There is, I believe, a care home group who are looking at the borders to put in 6 or 7 homes. Was it you was talking about that?
It was me who was telling you about
Correct,
it,
yeah.
yes.
So that tells me that's retirees. These retirees are in a Tory incomers area, and they're putting 6 homes down there on the borders. And
That's
these are
right.
the people who will not be voting yes to Scottish independence. They're up here for different, or they're up in Scotland for different reasons.
Absolutely. And what's more, I mean, the consultant who told me about this had written to all the elected representatives from all the areas across the borders. 13, I believe, in total he had written to. And he'd only got replies from 4 out of the 13. All 4 were Tories. They all wrote back saying they were fully in favour of it. Great idea. And that included the Secretary of State for Scotland. And he was the first reply. It came back, return the mail. So what you're saying there is correct. I mean, we are getting played on a massive scale.
Yeah.
You know, that's why there was no census in Scotland. It happened in Wales, it happened in England, it happened in Northern Ireland. But Nicola said, oh, because of COVID, we can't do it. Well, how does COVID come into a census? An envelope comes in your door, you fill it in, you send it back. COVID's not involved in it. What was involved was she didn't want these figures coming out before May's elections because there would have been uproar. But the uproar is going to come next year. But of course, next year, it's only the local elections and Nicola's not involved.
Now, you'll have met this problem, Alf, and I've been getting a lot of it recently, is that, you're a blood and soil nationalist, Roddy, and this is no good, and it's bad, and it's terrible. And I ask, and I immediately retort when someone says that to me, well, name me any other country in the world that allows foreign nationals to get off the plane and get a vote, apart from Scotland. And the answer, of course, you get all sorts of, and I had someone who purports to be a supporter of Scottish independence and a mover and shaker, who gave me quite a lot of absolute dog's abuse on this. And then said, well, no, remember, he's one of us, one of the independentistas. He said, I'll give you a country that gives you the full franchise. He went, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. There you go. What? I said, what about the 2.5 million EU citizens that were excluded from the 2016? That's irrelevant. They allowed the Jamaicans and the Irish to vote. If you've got people on our own side who are as ignorant and stupid as that, we really have a hard job in our hands here, Alf, explaining.
Yeah, well, Roddy, I covered it in quite some detail in the book Dún Hodden, but which had a chapter all on its own for demographics as well, because that is one of the key determinants of independence. It's the people that vote. So your demographics are vitally important. And what we saw with the demographics is that for the last 20 years, there's been an average of about 50,000 plus people coming in from the south, from England mainly, to Scotland. Scotland's birth rate is also at a historic low. So as Mike Russell himself announced at a seminar some time ago in the Borders, Scotland is not reproducing itself. He gave that as a justification to allow more and more people to come in. But the problem we have then, as Iain rightly said, is that the franchise we're using is not a national franchise, it's a local government franchise. Mm-hmm. So it's based on residence. So any Tom, Dick or Harry basically can register to vote on on whether Scotland exists as an independent state. So in effect, other countries would look at this really as a leakage of sovereignty rather than a protection of sovereignty. And really a national government's first objective should be to protect sovereignty, because without sovereignty, that people can disappear. That people are then perishable. And that's what colonialism tells us. It tells us that without sovereignty, a people are running the risk of perishing, their nation and their people. We, in addition to that, have no control over our borders, as we saw with COVID and the wider devastating effect that COVID had. So that's our problem. Our problem is we have no control over the borders. Sovereignty is leaking, and we're using a local government franchise. It's like a total setup by Perfidious Albion.
Exactly.
And you're probably right. Michael Gove is probably planning a referendum quite soon because he's guaranteed to win it.
Yeah, Gareth. Slightly on the same topic, you know,
nobody.
We're not saying to me that Scotland is not a colony. I say, well, no, technically it's not, but we're treated and we behave like a colony. Because if I go to COP26, here is the world arriving in Scotland to discuss renewables and climate, etc. Now, Scotland has got more renewables than probably any other single country in the world, with tidal and wind, etc. And we have no voice. You know, it's in our nation, in our biggest city, but we're excluded. An English toff is coming up to speak in our behalf. Isn't that disgusting?
There's no doubt we're colonised. We're certainly colonised culturally, economically, geographically. There's a whole swathe of institutions that have been colonised. We might not be colonised quite yet constitutionally, But, England has had 300 years to get its men in the right place, its foot soldiers. I notice that people don't ask the accusers of blood and soil to define what they mean, because what they're trying to put into people's heads with this slogan is Nazism. Mm-hmm. It's purebred Scots. And occasionally they will betray that is their thinking by retorting immediately, what is a pure Scot? Mm. And I have to say, well, it's people who've been born and bred here, and they can point to parents and grandparents, some of whom, like me, had Irish grandparents. So you go to any country and it's an amalgamation of various ethnic types and races that have, over time, gotten together and at some point or other are living in a land that they think is their own. They can govern as their own. So I reject the inference, the implication that blood and soil is some kind of neo-Nazism. The neo-Nazism are the colonialists who are doing their best to stop us getting full democracy. I mean, you've seen the times I threw out the wry comment, Scotland gets too much democracy. But it's not just a joke, it's true. That's what our English friends think we get, and they keep trying to curb it. So that's colonialism. And the blood and soil, well, those Edinburgh folk in 1707 who rioted in the centre of Edinburgh, burnt down a couple of houses, were they blood and soil? They weren't given a vote. They didn't want their Scotland handed over to England because they'd lived through some of the bloodiest passages of Scottish English history, and they knew there'd be worse to come. So blood and soil, I don't have a problem with that, especially not with my propensity for gardening and creating gardens. It's just another goddamn empty slogan, too small, too wee and too red-haired, or whatever they want to call us. We live on fried Mars bars and we don't like vegetables. They're still saying these things, having a good laugh.
But here, Iain, and I think I speak for all of us here, and a lot of people who agree with this, we're not saying it's just to be ethnic Scots, because that's another thing that they're twisting the narrative, because even, as Alf pointed out in his book, and in an article about the New Caledonian franchise, for example, what we're saying is not just Scots, people that have shown a commitment to this country. What I think, I certainly I'm speaking for me, and the rest of you can speak for yourselves. But I don't want to see people who are, for example, the armed services are up here on a secondment for 6 or 9 months, getting allowed to vote. That people who are on a part-time contract for a year or 2 years working in the oil rigs or working up in Aberdeen being allowed. People with a second home. Students who are up here to do a 2 or a 3 year course being allowed to get a say. Now, I go back to my own situation here in Catalonia. I pay taxes. I'm in the community. I do all sorts of things. I can only vote in local elections, and I don't have a problem with that. I chose to come and live here. How dare I tell them whether they should be governed from Madrid or Barcelona? I've chosen to live here for my reasons in their country. It's up to them to decide to me, do you still want to stay here? Because that's how we want governed. You would agree with that, Iain?
I would, of course I would. I mean, I think there should, of course, be a residency qualification. If you're here, say, between 5 and 10 years, that's showing a commitment to Scotland, and that's perfectly reasonable that a vote should be extended to you. But I would caution here, particularly for the English people who are living in Scotland, no one on our side here is trying to worsen relations between Scots and English people who have chosen this country as their home. None of us. But what would concern me is if a growing feeling and a growing number of Scots become very aware that Westminster are trying to inflict on us an unfair franchise which disadvantages Indigenous Scots, the folk that live and work in this country, against their best interest, then I think the relationship which exists at the moment, which in the main is very, very good, I think that would start to become threatened. And I don't want to see that. I mean, what we're talking about here is not saying we don't want any English people to live in Scotland. What we're saying is we don't want too many to come here and be handed a right that might well, given the difference in size between our population and England's population, absolutely submerge the Scottish will and the Scottish right. And we can't have that.
I think we have to be pretty ruthless about this question. I believe that we've got to stop giving explanations every time we're challenged.
Yep.
And the answer is, no, this is Scotland. I'm a Scot, and I wish to govern my own country. And you, who've arrived here, you will also be invited in to govern an aspect of it if you so desire and are so elected. But meantime, I will decide on this nation's future, and it isn't going to be North England. You really have to, you really got to turn around to these people and just bite their nose off, because otherwise they're like yapping dogs. They'll just keep biting at your heel. There was a time that the National Gallery of Scotland had a director who refused to show Scottish artists. When he was challenged, and he was challenged a few times, he quite openly said, "I absolutely hate Scottish art." So, there's a policeman in Scotland telling the Scots, "You're crap. I'd rather show a Dutch artist, I'd rather show a dead Dutch artist than a live Scots one." And he's not the exception to the rule. Luckily, the new chap is much more enlightened. He probably knows what's good for him.
Well, Alf, your view, you don't think it should just be purely indigenous?
As you guys fairly well know, I've been studying post-colonial literature quite deeply, and what that tells us is that that colonialism is prejudice, but it's also racism, because it's dependent on that superior culture, which in our case is Anglophone, and the Scottish language and culture is diminished by necessity in that model, that colonial hierarchy. So we have that colonial hierarchy, that meritocracy, if you like, that dominates discourse in Scotland, and politics, economics, all the rest of it. So that's the reality, that colonialism is racism, it is prejudice, and that is the root of the inequality we have. And we have half the people in the country living in or close to poverty. That's a colonial legacy. That's a lack of opportunity. And I saw it myself in the universities, that a lot of our people were struggling to get into, especially higher degrees like PhDs. There's no funding for them. There's plenty of funding internationally to send international students to Scottish universities to do PhDs and to do postgrad degrees and all the rest of it, and indeed undergraduate degrees. And these are the people that then get into the conveyor belt of the higher quality employment opportunities. So we're actually, through this colonial kind of nature that our colonial mindset as well is another aspect, but we're stuck in this kind of position where half of our people are disenfranchised, are marginalized, to some extent largely by the way they speak. And that's the reality that we're in. Colonialism does that. Where colonialism gets even worse, though, is that the literature on this, like not just Fanon, but also Memmi and Césaire, talk about the root of colonialism is fascism itself. And we see that rising as we've gone in the last couple of years, with the hounding of Alex Salmond, with the pushing of the arms of the state against independence people, leading independence campaigners, and the imprisonment of Ambassador Murray. So we see all that. That's how it behaves. And we then get into the reality also about what does a dominant national party do? How does it behave? And we see how it behaves, and it does behave a bit like a gang in that nature. It's very reactive to any criticism at all. It's not
which is the classic hallmark of fascism.
At all. It's going to attack it.
Sorry, what was that, Gareth?
No other policy, no other view is acceptable to the fascist group. Whatever the leader says, That's the policy, that's the law, that's the word. So
Sounds familiar.
It's I find, like, I'm assuming like Professor Baird, that's what we're facing with our own SNP party. That's what I find alarming.
No.
Just for me to try and get a letter answered by them is almost impossible. If they don't want it, if they don't want to answer a letter, they just won't. If they want to answer an email, they just won't do it. Exactly as Alfred said, you become marginalized. It's like when my film work took off very quickly, extremely quickly. I went from a small television series involving young people in drama to a near £3 million political thriller set in Scotland, and then a movie. So, the world started to come knocking on my door, usually with a foxed script, and definitely asking for money. But the odd thing was that the London boys, the ones who call it the British film industry, they closed the fund doors. The funds were all in London, generally chaired by David Putnam. He had a finger in every pie. So if you fell out with David Putnam, you were liable not to even get development money, a £5,000 grant to try and get a first draft of a script together. So, I have experienced what it's like to work in the British state only to discover that my culture isn't wanted. My projects are not wanted, but my money is wanted. And of course, as my American backers arrived, the news got around like mad. And London producers came up to say, Gareth, we've got this guy. I think one of the cast is Scottish, and I was wondering if you might want to invest in our films, So, I'm making light of it, but I just got angrier and angrier.
No wonder.
In the end, I decided that there wasn't a future for making films in Scotland, and that's one reason that I moved to Los Angeles, where I was welcomed with open arms, which was really a really odd feeling. And they even liked my accent. I didn't actually have to flatten my accent to sound terribly English,
Gareth, I think this also goes back to the issue about in colonialism, the colony becomes, or it remains in an underdeveloped state.
Absolutely.
The people aren't developed, they're not given the opportunities. And then you have what they term a mediocre meritocracy, because the only people rising to the top are basically the colonizer and people who want to be like the colonizer.
Exactly.
So that's the only people who rise to the top. And the rest of the native community, they're not good enough. Their culture's not good enough. They're just not good enough to do it. So you end up with a mediocre meritocracy and an underdeveloped people and nation.
To bring you back to that, guys, could I just...
Our parliament was just a pretendy parliament. I took what he was saying was they just jumped up councillors. Not that Scotland did not deserve a parliament. It's just, and I some of my close friends said, did you hear so-and-so making a speech? And they were cringing, and I would say, well, look, we haven't had a parliament for 300 years. What are you expecting of them? And they were expecting of them to be clones of
Westminster,
of the House of Commons.
Yep.
Whereas our parliament was set up and designed by the architect to be non-confrontational. And the first thing the Tories and the Labours did was just to copy, what the House of Commons does, which is two sets of benches facing each other so you can harangue each other, and there's a chairman in the middle on a very high chair who can sort things out. So it's really depressing, but you have to give people hope. You have to say we can change this and we can make it better. But to do that, you need to be aware that you might be colonized yourself in your attitude to things, that your nation is colonized, and there are things that you will have to fix really quickly. You have to know these things, and you have to have a tremendous confidence
And it starts with the people that you elect.
Well, absolutely.
Because they need to have the mindset that, you know, Scotland is capable. Scotland can do these things. Scotland must do these things. And they need the courage to face down Westminster, you know, to explain to the people why they're facing down Westminster. None of that happens in Scotland. We drift along, all jolly, getting absolutely nowhere, being treated like a pet dog. You know, it's about time we actually became a pack of wolves and started tearing down some of the folk that are responsible for that.
Which would be what I was going to say to you.
That includes when the SNP, by the way.
I was going to say to you, Ian, when we're talking about the colonial attitude, the two things. One, we are sort of cowed, and there's this. Oh, don't this blood and soil stuff. You'll upset, you know, the English neighbours and the soft nose and all this sort of stuff. Whereas, and everything's, you know, don't frighten the horses. But going back to what happened with, we started on Cummings, the Irish, Leo Varadkar, who's our friends in Ireland, is an Irish Tory. Yeah. And usually, as you know, politicians are very guarded in what they're saying and how they react. He just opened up and gave both barrels and was talking about perfidious.
Briefly, Tonish, if you would. Dominic Cummings, Boris Johnson's former advisor, has said that the UK government never intended to stick with the Brexit deal that it negotiated with you. They did that negotiation. They made those promises to win an election and intended to ditch bits of it afterwards. And that's what we are... That's what we are seeing with David Frost yesterday. In the context of what David Frost said about scrapping the Northern Ireland Protocol, can the UK government be trusted on Brexit now?
You know, I've seen those comments. I hope Dominic Cummings is speaking for himself and not for the British government. But those comments are very alarming because that would indicate that this is a government and administration that acted in bad faith. And that message needs to be heard around the world because if the British government doesn't honour its agreements, doesn't adhere to treaties it signs, that must apply to everyone else too. So at the moment they're going around the world, they're trying to negotiate new trade agreements. Surely the message must go out to all countries around the world that this is a British government that doesn't necessarily keep its word, doesn't necessarily honour the agreements it makes, and you shouldn't make any agreement with them until such a time as you're confident that they keep their promises and honour things, for example, like the protocol.
And that's what we need to be doing, Ian, surely, instead of just sitting here quietly.
Absolutely. If you didn't know who he was, you'd have probably suspected he was Sinn Féin, you know? And what he was saying was not dissimilar to what Sinn Féin were saying. And how refreshing to have someone stand up for their country, to speak openly and angrily about what was being done now. I mean, Boris picked the wrong country for two reasons. One, the Irish have got a long experience of experiencing what Westminster can do in the way of lies and cheating and all the rest. But the second reason, and it's the most important reason, they picked the wrong country. President Biden has made very, very clear, if the Irish get upset, he's going to get upset. And that changes the whole ballgame. You know,
I had someone say to me, Ian's right, I had someone say to me the other day that, we can't rely on the USA. You know, President Biden, he's all for a united Britain. Well, I've never heard him actually say that. I've not actually heard him say that, but even if he did say that, he's made plain he's not English. He's Irish, of Irish descent. Absolutely, got that established right away.
Yeah, and that interview with the BBC, the guy came up to him and said, "I'm from the BBC." President went, "I'm Irish," and just walked away from the BBC.
That's essentially what I'm saying about our opponents. You know, we have to become ruthless in the way we treat them. You know, and treat them as the fools that they are. It's after we get our independence restored, we can afford to be magnanimous. That's the moment that you say, "Yes, you're welcome. Stay here." You know,
speak for yourself.
Don't spoil that land. You know, that's a nature reserve. You know, Don't paint the front of your house red and put Union Jacks up, please, because that's not their flag. There are a whole lot of things that we can do. But first of all, we really have to scare the living daylights out of the colonials that are here. And as I'm sure Alfred will attest, we have to cleanse our own minds of, well, we're not quite as good as them guys down there. And if we do this, they will retaliate that way. And until eventually you can talk yourself into kind of a state of permanent anxiety.
Well, that's what they've done.
Frozen.
That's exactly the position we're in. We've got a government that's feared. We've got a First Minister that's so timid, unbelievably timid. And, but that's why I suspect it's all an act. And she's playing a game with Westminster's approval. I demand a referendum, and eventually they'll say, well, there it is, Nicola, there's your referendum. And here's the rules. And that's the trap we're in. We need to start pursuing the plebiscite election as being the method. No other method. Plebiscite, we should copy the suggestions from the Scottish Sovereignty Research Group and bring our MPs back to Holyrood to sit down with all our elected representatives, and we should vote to end the Treaty of Union. And we should do it the first day of COP26. And that will guarantee it's the front page of every newspaper in the world.
Yeah.
And we'll find out very quickly who our friends are.
Yeah, sadly, our First Minister will not do that. That's just a fact.
Well,
that's what she should do.
Not unless there's a battery of cameras guaranteed to turn up.
Yeah. And she could get a selfie or two in,
Yeah, but it brings me on this, Alf, from your research, and I really do want to go on to the ports because that's very important. And I've been trying to get you to talk about the ports in your last couple of visits, but this always seems to overtake it. And we'll come to that. And I know that Gareth's got a question for you as well and the clock is ticking. Is what we're talking about, is there anything that you know, an impediment to the Scottish elected representatives, the voice of the sovereign people of Scotland, and ending the Treaty of Union, to the best of your knowledge?
Well, I've had some input to the Sovereignty Research Group that Mark McNaught chairs, and that also has quite a few international people with legal and international relations experience. And they're all of the view, as I am, that the Scottish national representatives are the sovereign representatives. Scots have sovereignty. We have a treaty. They're duty bound to bring that treaty to an end if it's no longer in the national interest. So that's the international aspect of this. If a treaty is no longer in the national interest, it's ended. And that all countries around the world understand that. We are told that somehow we have to get a Section 30 or some other hoop. Or Alistair Jack says you need 60% in the polls. So every time you get closer and closer, they put the hoops up or the hurdles. And we can expect that from Perfidious Albion because that's who they are. They'll always put the hurdles up. But the reality of the situation is, as the Sovereignty Research Group showed, is that ending a treaty is a relatively simple thing. And it just requires, as Iain and Gareth said, a more courageous government. And that goes back to the Estonian example, which Iain knows very well, that the Estonians there said, what was the most important thing for independence? And they said, well, it was the courage of the political leaders to declare independence at the right time. And at the right time is important as well. And that's why some of us have raised the issue about COP26, where you've got the world's media here, you've got 140 world leaders here, prime ministers and presidents. What better time have you got to say to Boris, enough is enough? Brexit was the big breach. Northern Ireland looks like it's going, and Biden will probably go with that. It's time for Scotland to go as well, before they start gerrymandering with more MP reductions and all the rest of it, because that's coming down the track, as is the other acts coming down that will neuter Scotland beyond belief. So Scotland is in a very precarious situation now. And we get back to this situation in colonialism where loss of sovereignty means a nation, a people are gradually perishing the longer they leave it. So the longer Nicola and her colleagues leaves this, the worse it becomes. And also further down the track, the worse the possible outcomes might be for a number of reasons. And we only have to look at Northern Ireland for that.
Well, you know, if she's waiting to 2023, it takes only a few MPs in the House of Commons in the late night sitting to pass a bill endorsed by only a majority of 3 in the House of Lords, so that states categorically a nation can't have a referendum more than 1 in 20 years. You know, if they're really arrogant, more than once in 50 years. Or like our original devolution bill,
40%.
there must be 40, 50, 60% minimum. They can do all of that and have all that in place. And then that means trailing another year going to trail down to what's called the UK Supreme Court. Yeah. And saying,
let me tell you,
cheated again.
let me give you a bit of news about a very short story. I don't believe even the leadership of the SNP believe there's any prospect of us becoming independent in 2023. Now, let me give you a bit of evidence. The city of Stirling Council, SNP controlled, has entered and been approved as a Scottish entry for the 2025 UK City of Culture. Alan Smith is over the moon about it. You know, all the SNP people. Now, you know, these are the same folk that are telling us that Nick's going to have this referendum in 2023 and we're going to be independent. But they're busy applying to be the UK City of Culture in 2025. Now, that was an Alba councillor that passed me that information, so thanks to her for doing so. But, I mean, it really is outrageous what the senior members of the SNP are up to. They're lying to the people while behind their backs they're trying to do deals with the UK government. Ridiculous.
Yeah, but here's the thing. When we got the Scotland Bill, the vow, which Alf touched on earlier, we had 56 out of 59 MPs, and we did 100 and odd, I can't remember exactly how many it was, 110 or whatever, amendments, all of which were rejected by the majority English MPs, with one Mundell, one Tory MP and one Labour Tory, whatever you want to call Murray, backing, you know, voting with the English against. But the only thing that we've ever, all the time we've been down there, whether we had one MP, 26, 56, or 48 Scottish independence MPs now, we've never had we've never got anything through there. No amendments, no acts, except one, the claim of right. They didn't go against that. Now, is that significant, or was it because it was so insignificant? I think it's because they're scared of the claim of right and the sovereign will of the Scottish people. What do you say to that, Alf?
Well, that's the only tool we have in the toolbox, really, at the end of the day, Roddy, is sovereignty. And Scots sovereignty is recognised by Westminster. You've just said it. They accepted that. They agreed to it. It's the only thing they've ever really agreed to in our favour.
Exactly.
But yeah, that's the reality.
It's the only thing we've never used. We've never used it.
Well, this is the problem. There's no point in talking with sovereignty unless people are prepared to use it. And Iain alluded to the SNP MPs. The SNP MPs seem so quiet. It's like they've disappeared into the ether, apart from the occasional article from Ms. Cherry. But apart from that, nothing. And all the MSPs as well, you hear nothing. All you hear from the dominant National Party is things coming down from on high.
But that's because it's all controlled. Yeah. If you're an MSP or an MP of the SNP, you're not allowed to put out a press release. Everything has to go through an approved press officer. And he controls, and basically what that means is Nicola's got to say it's okay, or else it doesn't go. You know?
Peter.
Yeah, it could well be Peter as well.
Well, it's certainly not the open government, you know, that we were
promised now.
We thought we were going to actually see. We thought we were creating. It's more of a personal fiefdom. And you're right. By all accounts, from people who are her colleagues, she absolutely brooks no dissent. I mean, you might get off with asking a question of clarification on a policy, but you dare not suggest an alternative to it. Otherwise, you might get actually, removed from the group, and that's not an exaggeration.
Yeah, the problem is that she's desperate to get
thrown under the proverbial bus all the time, and one of them in jail. And today, dare I mention it, the extreme censorship of an English MP being murdered in his own constituency by some young guy. We'll find out if there was a reason.
Shocking.
Mentally ill. And our First Minister did the right thing. She expressed deep sadness and concern. Now, when Joanna Cherry was being attacked by one individual and threatened with death, sexual harassment, I tried hard, but I couldn't find a condemnation from her.
No.
And, I don't know about anyone else, anyone watching this, but that tells me something about our First Minister that I do not like.
Because it's those things, Gareth, that you let them get away with it, and then you have this terrible tragedy, or for example, with Joe Cox. If you've got to hammer these things from the start, abuse of the MPs, anyone threatening MPs. This is our elected representative, whether it's a Tory, a Labour, Liberal, it doesn't matter. Otherwise, democracy is over. And you've got to hit it in the head. Now, we're running out of time rapidly. And I know you've got a question, Gareth, for Alf. Is it on constitutional matters or something else?
It was constitutional. It was to ask, I'm getting the feeling we're all agreed about this, but to ask Alf if he himself feels the same way. And that is that it'll be a deathly risk to go into another referendum, even with modifications to the franchise, that we need to take one of the other tracks. And unfortunately, we do not have the administration and power with the capacity or the courage to do it. That's a question to you, Alf, if you feel that's right.
I think we probably are heading towards Quebec too, because we have all the characteristics as well, where the National Party itself is less than excited about the outcome, and is more content with the status quo. So it's never going to fight an exciting campaign, and it's no funds to fight anyway, apparently. But I think the fact is the demographics are totally against us on this. Demographics are totally against us, and I think also within Scotland there's a degree of apathy growing now from even within the independence movement about what the SNP have actually done to the momentum. They've just killed it to some extent. So I think that's a worry as well. Ultimately, though, as a matter of law, we know that a referendum isn't a requirement for independence. So why are we bothering with it in the first place?
Yeah.
We're not a colony in a constitutional sense. We have sovereignty, and we have a treaty, a worthless piece of paper in a sense, but we have a treaty, and any representatives of this country need to do is just withdraw from that treaty-based agreement under international law. That's all that's required. But what I would say is that, if there's probably thousands of us in the independence movement would quite happily take the place of 40-odd SNP MPs and pull out of Westminster tomorrow. If they want to do it, we'll do it. There's thousands of us probably queuing up, ready to take their place. All these MPs in London that the SNP send down there are totally bloody useless. There's plenty of us willing to take their place.
Nicola was sitting there addressing the Arctic Circle environmental delegates, and there was another opportunity missed. I mean, surely she's got a good speechwriter somewhere who's got a sense of humour, where she could have welcomed them, to the only country in the world that was a nation state, that wasn't a nation state, And,
yeah, well,
made some
as it
comments
happens, I was
neighbour.
at one time the agent for Iceland Steamship Company in Leith a long time ago, and I actually taught in Iceland and attended a couple of Arctic conferences there run by the ministry. And these are very important events that Scotland should be well connected with and well involved. It was a great opportunity, I thought, for her to negotiate Scotland's EFTA entry with Iceland and Norway there, and probably others as well.
Oh, the Nordic Council.
Yeah,
and the Nordic
she
Council
could
as well.
have negotiated Scotland's entry, and then in a couple of weeks' time pulled the plug on the Union in front of 140 prime ministers and presidents.
She got a selfie with the prime minister of Iceland.
Well, if she likes the limelight, what bigger limelight than COP26? That is the biggest platform the first minister could ever envisage. And if she's going to tell them that Scotland wants to join the International Club of Nations, that would be the time to do it.
Absolutely. Guys, we've run out of time, and I still haven't. I wanted to discuss these 41 ferry. Next time, I'm not bringing those two back, Alf. They're the problem. Those two chatterboxes. What I'll do is I'll hopefully try and get Douglas Chapman, because I'd really like to talk about opening up not just Rosyth, but all sorts of other. And understand why we can't or why we're not doing it at present. So I'll get you back. Alf. I don't know about these two, but I'll definitely get you back.
Alf, did you not present a report on ferry port development to SNP, and was it ignored? Was it?
Yes, Roy Peterson, who used to be head of transport for Highlands Enterprise, and we developed a maritime policy for the SNP Westminster Group. They commissioned us to do it. That was about 3 years ago, and the recommendations of that policy were passed by the SNP conference. The last one in, I think, 2019 or 2019, pre-COVID, these recommendations were passed and to be implemented. We followed that up with the SNP MPs, but they've just ignored us. They have no interest in taking forward the recommendations, even although the conference passed it and recommended these policies should be put in place. And that included developing direct connections with the Europe, like Ireland's done with their new Dunkirk terminal for Ireland.
Oh, they've done that with currency as well, though.
Exactly, yeah, I was going to say that.
It's a common thing. They passed currency, then ignored that.
Yeah, they've completely ignored the members.
Yeah, but I was going to say, knowing the Irish, Dunkirk wasn't chosen at random, I would suggest, knowing our good Irish friends. That's great. Guys, I could, and I'm sure a lot of the people who are watching this could sit here for a lot longer. And I wish I could say like normal. I've got a wee gin waiting me, but that's one thing about my recent illness. I'm right off the gin. It's terrible. I'm going to see the doctor about it. It's not acceptable.
You've now convinced us it was serious.
Guys, can I thank each and every one of you as always for your contribution. And to you, our viewers and listeners, I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have, as I always do with my compadres here. But until I and my friends here see you again, please, take care.
Cheerio.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.